I would like to welcome each and every one of you. This morning, we started the day, and so far it was extremely joyful and enjoyable. And I'd like to really thank wholeheartedly the organizers. And with your permission, I would like to mention two names. Mr. Doğan Bermek and Miss Vanessa Obaldia. They have really worked very hard for organizing this invaluable conference. And also there are many names that I cannot list at the moment, but there are many of them. So I would like to thank each and every one of them, all the discussants, all the panelists, and attendees, of course. Now, in this panel, we have two distinguished speakers, Cemal Salman and Lucia Kriyannis Salazar. We have two distinguished social scientists with us. With your permission, I would like to briefly introduce the panelists, and right after that, I will be giving the floor to, first of all, Cemal Salman, and then to Ms. Salazar, and each will have 20 minutes for their presentations. Cemal Salman is a member of Istanbul University Political Science Faculty. He's been working on various issues since his graduate studies. Very briefly, for example, he worked on Alevites in Germany, Alevites in Britain. He's been also working on the Syrian refugees in Turkey, and in general, he specializes in migration, city, and places. The other speaker is from Mexico, Ms. Salazar, and she is currently continuing her PhD studies at the Freie Universität in Berlin, and she is writing a dissertation on the transformation of the Sufi lodges in Turkey after their official closure, connecting the different forms of tekkes that exist nowadays with the historical narratives from contemporary Sufi communities about the law that banned the Sufi orders. And she is also working on Sufism in Turkey and in Mexico, and that is definitely a very deep topic, and it would, I wish we had time and we had more time to discuss her findings in her PhD dissertation. I hope that when she completes her dissertation, we will have other chances. Now, I would like to give the floor to Cemal Salman. He will be talking about construction, struggle, intervention, the transformation dynamics of Alevite social space. The floor is yours. Professor, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that I'm very honored to be speaking at a session where you are a discussant. This is very important to me. And thank you very much for being with us. Also, I would like to thank Mr. Bermek and Ms. Obaldia from ADIP. We have been corresponding with, I have been corresponding with them for a while in the organization phase of this conference. And I would also like to thank all those who have worked in the organization of this event. As you have mentioned, for many years, I've been working on issues related to Alevite identity and the transformation of the Alevite identity. And my work is mostly based on field studies. And my presentation will be about the things that I have accumulated throughout these studies. I'll be talking about the social space, and I consider that category as an inseparable part of the places of worship. So first of all, very briefly, I would like to provide a theoretical framework with your permission, and after that, I will continue with the details. Now, I think maybe we should start from Halbwachs and Nora, Pierre Nora. When we're talking about the intersections of the social space and the place and the memory spaces. For quite a long time, memory spaces were always considered as indexed to time. But we know that in the last 30 to 40 years, the literature has changed a lot. And now space and memory are much more closely linked. And because memory also builds the relations of power. So if we see the reflections of the social memory in space, then we have to also consider that this is at the same time intertwined with relations of power. And in the rest of my presentation, I will also try to develop on French thinker Lefebvre's work on his triad of space. I'll talk about his theory of space. Now, Lefebvre does not consider space as a two-dimensional realm. He divides it. I mean, he tackles it in three realms. So this is called the triad in his category, and I will try to tackle or analyze the Alevite spaces accordingly. And I will also talk about the concepts of isotopia and heterotopia. As you know, these were introduced by Michel Foucault based on the Lefebvre's contributions. Isotopia in fact means a single topos and its environs. So basically, we're talking about a homologue space. On the other hand, we also have heterotopia. Heterotopia brings along other topos. So simultaneously, several topos or spaces are presented with this concept, as Lefebvre says. Now, Foucault's heterotopia is more detailed compared to Lefebvre's approach, of course, and to him, such spaces existed in all civilizations, and they all had their own particular functions. And sometimes these different spaces or places may seem not to be getting along with each other. However, it is possible for them, for heterotopia, to bring along different things. These, in fact, accumulate time, and this also takes us back to the discussion or makes a reference to the discussion of memory and history. And at the same time, Foucault says that all these spaces have a different function. Now, Lefebvre brings about, as you know, a triad, and when he's talking about the social space, he says that this, basically here we see a production of space. So space is not only where the human being exists. So it's not a tabula rasa, it's not an empty plane which comes about with existence. On the contrary, these produce social relationships, and every social form also produces these spaces. And according to Lefebvre, you can only understand space by deciphering all those different layers. So it cannot be considered as detached from the ideology. So it's always ideological and it's always political. And this issue is crucial for us because when we think about the Alevite social space, we have to make a reading, ideological and political reading of it. So the social space or space of faith has social roots as well. Before I continue with the Alevite social space, I would like to share with you some of the assumptions, and then I will begin to talk about the Alevite social space. Now, during the 16th or 15th century, we began to clearly see the new position of Alevites. The Kızılbaş or Alevites began to go to remote places, and we can perhaps say that the Alevites who were subjected to long-term slaughter and persecution following the Ottoman-Safavid War continued their existence in the mountainous rural regions of Anatolia from 15th to 16th century until the mid-20th century. And their basic structures, rituals were developed in this kind of an environment. Very soon I will be talking about the Ocak system. And the Ocak system is in fact a solution, a social solution, in which you will not have any need to any public service. And that's how they have developed this Ocak system. And with the 1950s, we begin to see the change in this structure. And the main reason behind this is migration and urbanization. The process of urbanization started to change all the structures, rituals, and approaches or solutions that the Alevites have found. And there is a critical thing. The 1960s, that is an important milestone, because usually people say that the transition from the Ottoman era to the Young Republic as a rupture. However, that is not the case. We see that there is a continuity in the policies about the Alevites in politics. Now, I mentioned before how social space is analyzed by Lefebvre, and he considered this as a three-part momentum. So essentially, we have the mental space or the intellectually designed space, as Lefebvre says. And in the Alevite tradition, we also see a similar representation of space. Now, as you know, for the Alevite, there's a different perception of time. The same is also true for space. It's a multi-layered or cyclical space. And when that is the case, of course, the realm of spirits has a different time. Because, I mean, in all Alevite myths and literature, for example, the Council of Forties or the Miraj, or in the Kerbela parables, or in the stories about Salman Farsi, or in the Hacı Bektaş legends, in all of these narratives, which are in fact the cornerstones of the Alevite myths, there is a different perception of space. This is called la mekan, and we can consider this as a non-space as well. And philosophically, this is how space is configured in the Alevite tradition. For example, what we call the Council of Forties, this is not something that is experienced in a non-existing time. On the contrary, this is an existence. This is something that comes to being in every jam meeting. Now, in the Alevi spatial practice, everyday life or everyday places are tried to be transferred into this non-space, this la mekan. And so every moment in life is in fact a moment for worship. And when you have that kind of an understanding in the Alevite villages, they never needed a specific place of worship. And during this time frame, of course, at the same time, there were a lot of pressures on the Alevites. That's another reason for not having any space. So both external effects and also the intrinsic traits of the Alevite tradition does not necessitate the formation of the Alevite places of worship in the rural areas. So, but of course, there were dede rooms or large hovels. So these were places where people could practice jam, come together. And on days of jam, these places were cleaned and they were transformed into places of worship, a sacred site. So in the Alevite tradition, in the rural parts, we have to see that there is no fixed place for worship. It constantly transforms itself. And the same is also true for the visiting places in the Alevite understanding. And of course, this is not specific to the Alevites. However, in the rural parts, for example, if you see a certain well or a single tree or a mountain, so the ordinary eye might see these as ordinary features of nature. However, with the myths dedicated to these places are transformed into sacred places. And the people living nearby consider these places as sacred places. For centuries, this has been the practice. Now, let us try to bring together these two issues together. Earlier, I had talked about the Ocak system and this perception of place or the production of space. Now, social space maybe you can see it here as well. Every individual who has grown up in this tradition has a dede, and they have their own ocak, and all of these are, in fact, evolving in the form of a cycle. I would like to give you a representational map of Turkey. It doesn't look very nice, I know, but at least as an abstraction, you can see, for example, here, Mürşit, Dede, Ocak, and other Ocaks. So in the Anatolian geography, in the places where we have denser Alevite population, we can establish or come up with such invisible maps. And this I consider a heterotopic map once again. And the Alevite tradition that evolved in this geography for hundreds of years ago developed its own means of communication and narratives of faith. And so far, until the 20th century, the Alevite tradition was able to therefore transfer itself. So what do we have in hand at the moment? Now, what we call as the Alevite social space, since its formation, initial formation, with the onset of the pressures dating back to 15th to 16th century, it converges the space. And this has two reasons. One is there is the pressure coming from the majority, and also because of their own faith. And in the production of this space, from the Ottoman era to the Republican era and the migration phase, there was a continuum. And the borders or the boundaries defining the places of worship and social space are very vague. The whole of the map that I provided you earlier can also be considered as a space of faith. So I consider that the whole of that social space. So in this regard, for many centuries, we know that there were pressures exerted by the majority, by the power, and the Alevites were, on the other hand, trying to struggle for building their identity, and they were doing it over and over again. And on the other hand, in every era that I mentioned in this time frame, this also was a product of the external pressures. So both from within and also from outside, there were interventions, and that brought about a continuous convergence of the Alevite social space. Now, I would like to give you some background information. Let me start from the external influences. I said that there was always such an intervention from outside, but especially during certain specific times in the history, those external dynamics created direct pressures and direct interventions. 1826, for example, that is called the Vakaya Hayriye in history, and that is a time that corresponds to the closure of the Bektashi lodges in 1826. And the Janissary Guild was violently dismantled with the explanation that they were, in fact, giving harm to the spirit of the army. And during that time, most of the Bektashi lodges were either destroyed or were made dependent to other strong religious orders. And in these tekkes, the Bektashi dedes and babas were either exiled or executed, and they were also checked, I mean, whether they were following the Sunnite practices or not. I won't go into the details of this issue, but in the next session, there is an expert, Yılmaz Soyer, and he will be providing an excellent detailed presentation on that. That's why I won't develop on this too much. But what do we see here? The closure of the tekkes was first seen during the Ottoman era, and with that, and with the exile and execution of some Bektashi dedes and babas, there was a very, I mean, most of the Bektashi tradition was destroyed. I'd like to continue with 1925, another milestone. And again, as part of the modernization program of the Young Republic, as you know, all lodges, zaviyas, and tombs, except for those already being used as mosques or masjids, were closed. And with the law number 677. That is one of the most extensive interventions on Alevite faith spaces. But of course, this is not directly targeting the Alevites. If you read the wording of the law, as you can see there, it is said that the places which are not already being used as mosques or masjids will be closed. And some, for example, titles are also mentioned. For example, Dede, Baba, others, Seyyed. So those titles are also abolished. So this had a critical effect for the Alevite already during that time, until that time. Or tekkes were the places where the Alevite tradition was accumulated and where the Alevites would socially meet. And the people who were in charge of these places, the dedes or babas, were also fostering the Alevite culture. Now, if you close the tekkes and tombs outside of those that are already being used as mosques or masjids, this means that you are totally eliminating all Alevite faith spaces. Though some researchers say that, I mean, there was equal treatment in terms of these closures. However, the other traditions, faith traditions or orders were not as heavily affected as the Alevites. For example, in Kapukaya village of Bergama, there were some Alevites who were arrested for taking part in a jam, and they were taken to the assize court. And when you take a look at the newspaper archives of the era, again, for example, you will see news headlines such as 30 Alevites were arrested during a jam, or dedes were arrested. So you will find plenty of such news. And what is critical here is that there were some sanctions on jams during the Ottoman era, but this time with a law in written format, all of those rituals were banned. And within the village, for example, therefore, during the jam, somebody has to act as the watchdog. So not only the places were closed down, but also the exercise of jam rituals were banned. And there was close surveillance on the people who would lead the jams, and that created a lot of problems for many years. And the Hacı Bektaş dergahı, known as Serçeşme as well, was closed down until 1964, and it was only opened in 1964 for visits as a museum. In addition to these well-known and comprehensive interventions, we see other interventions as well to the Alevite social spaces. I will try to list how these were instrumentalized. First of all, they closed all lodges and zaviyas except for those already being used as mosques and masjids. And mosques and masjids were always under protection. And that also meant that there was a need for creating a new place of worship for the Alevites. When we take a look at the Village Law 442, and very recently Şükrü Aslan had an article on this matter, in this law, in the definition of village, the main place of worship is defined as a masjid or a mosque. And when we take a look at Article 14 of the same law, article in the Article 13, it is said that it has to be clearly stated where such rituals could be practiced. So even in with the law, with the introduction of this law, even in the Alevite villages, the state began to build mosques. And what follows this? And this is something that is most commonly expressed in the urbanization process of the Alevite community. Now, the Alevites were always refused to have their own place of worship. And we see the grounds of this with the law number 677 dated 1925, and also from Diyanet, many recommendations were made from the Presidency of Religious Affairs, and the focus is usually the Sunnite belief. We have only you have exceeded 7 minutes. Now, I won't go into the details, but I would like to share with you here on my screen, how many mosques were built in Alevite villages. And also in 1990s, for example, many jam places were intervened. The Istanbul mayor of the era, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, had intervened in these places. And in 2013 and 14, it was also clearly stated by the state that CEMEVIS cannot be considered as places of worship, and the sole place of worship is the mosque. These places could only be considered as a cultural venue. And we have also seen the same approach in some of the court decisions as well. But on the other hand, visiting places or Alevite tekkes or Alevite tombs, there were different attempts to transform them into mosques, and these interventions continue. While Alevis were trying to combat with all these kinds of interventions, they at the same time moved to the city. And they had to face with their internal dynamics. As I mentioned earlier, they had to transform their own, they had to transform their places while they were in the rural areas. And in the urban area, they tried to adopt the same approach. In the last 20 years, especially in the Alevite villages, the villagers sometimes converted old, deserted school buildings into CEMEVIS, or they collected money among themselves and built such places. On the other hand, in the metropolitan areas in Turkey or in different parts of Europe, again, they had to transform apartment buildings into CEMEVIS. And as they cannot have a legal status as CEMEVI, they were named as cultural spaces. For example, this is a photograph from a jam at the apartment building of an association. And we also see similar instances in European cities. In Cologne, Pors, a sports hall was transformed into a jam place. And as you can see, this place has a dual use. And the same is also true for the visiting places. In the rural parts, this was an important memory space, but of course, now as the population migrated to the urban areas, people started to forget this. This hill, for example, the hill that you see in the photograph is a visiting place. And around that tomb, there was an organization, and as you can see, a wall was built, but later on, the state put on a monument of Atatürk made in concrete. So this is not only the transformation, the intrinsic transformation of Alevi places of worship, but also there is an external intervention as well. Last but not least, I'd like to say that for many years, Alevis have been very moderate, but recently we started seeing very posh CEMEVIS, especially in Europe. And all of these tell us the following. Now, both due to the internal issues and also the external issues, the places of worship for the Alevis began to change, and the heterotopic, pluralistic places are now converting into posh places sometimes. And we see that these are now becoming the places of exercise of a certain culture. And thank you so much. And I'd like to apologize for taking so long.
Cemal Hocam. Ben de o halde fazla süre kaybetmeden ikinci
Thank you
konuşmacıya
so much.
döneceğim. Sayın
I would like to continue with the second speaker, Ms. Salazar.
Müze veya kültür merkezleri olarak Sufi tekkeleri kendi doktora çalışmasından bize.
So she's going to tell us about her PhD. We are now going to listen to her. Thank you very much for these kind words. And I am also delighted to be here. I will switch to English right now.
The topic of my, first let me share my screen in here. And that's, you can see it, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So the name of my presentation is Sufi Tekkes as Museums or Cultural Centers, the Seal of Secularity. So between 2016 and 2019, I conducted ethnographic research at 4 Turkish cities, Istanbul, Bursa, Konya, and Samsun. The topic of my interest was the past and fate of the Sufi lodges after their official closure in 1925 through the law
677 sayılı
we saw in the previous presentation, mostly referred to by my interlocutors as the law of Tekkes and Zaviyes. The purpose of my research was to find examples of the different kinds of places that are nowadays associated to the concept of the tekke, and to examine, in the cases where there is still a living Sufi community, how the kind of Sufi places that we see nowadays have been influenced by the event of the Tekkes official closure, and how contemporary Sufis narrate and explain that event. I found and analyzed tekkes that managed to survive the process of closure with some transformations, and that are still used and managed by the same Sufi orders that inhabited these places before 1925. There are also new kinds of tekkes founded recently in places like apartment buildings, sometimes after decades of semi-clandestine gatherings at cafes, shops, movie theaters, and other unsuspected environments. In some cases, the descendants of important Sufi lineages have created foundations that, they claim, are no longer tekkes, but a different and modern form of transmitting the message of their tarikats. And there are, of course, a considerable number of recently restored tekkes that function as museums and culture centers. Today's presentation will focus on the last 2 kinds of places. So, first, let me talk a little bit about the tekkes and the state as a double bind. The transformation of a Sufi lodge into a museum is, from its inception in 1927, barely a year after the closure of all the tekkes in Turkey, an indicative of a double bind between Sufi communities and the Turkish state. Although the museumization of tekkes has seen important transformations since the early Republican period, from the creation of the Museum of Ancient Artifacts in what had been the Mevlevi Central Lodge in Konya, to the recent proliferation of museums and cultural centers at restored old tekkes, the museumized tekke transmits a paradoxical message of simultaneous appropriation and othering of Sufism. The early Republican state was characterized by an undeniable hostility towards Sufis who reacted against the secularist project. But Sufism at large was not othered in the same way as non-Muslims, and as we have seen in the previous presentation, also Alevis. Instead of being associated to foreign countries, they were relegated to the past, turned into relics of the nation. In the violent process that produced the feared and adored fetish of the Turkish nation state, Sufis were caught in a double bind, in the sense Gregory Bateson gave to the term, through the paradoxical message of reverence of their culture and repudiation of their practices. Museumized tekkes perpetuate this double bind, and the living Sufi communities that preserve a relationship to these places confirm it through their simultaneous acceptance and resistance to secularization. So I'm going to talk about some of the cases I've studied of museumized tekkes. So one of the most interesting cases of my study is that of the International Mevlana Foundation, created in 1997 by a line of descendants of Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi and their relationship to the museumized Mevlevi Hanes. The foundation has two headquarters, an apartment in the upper middle class neighborhood of Nişantaşı in Istanbul, and a house in the immediate vicinity of the Mevlana Museum in Konya. They do not think of these places as tekkes, even though they use them for purposes of education in Mevlevi Sufism and sometimes ambiguously for ritual activities. The event of the closure of the tekkes is remembered simultaneously as a good and bad situation for their lineage. They embrace the official discourse that the measure was necessary to stop reactionary Sufis and lament that no exceptions could be made to protect their control over the Mevlevi tekkes. In fact, they even claimed that this feeling of regret was shared by Atatürk himself, and that the transformation of the tekke in Konya into a museum was his way of making an exception and keeping only that tekke open. Nowadays, they both embrace the Mevlevi Hanes function as a cultural institution and work against reducing Mevlevism to being just culture by promoting sohbets and authorized representations of the Sema, where the mystical meaning of Sufism is respected and transmitted. Although they do not demand to reconvert the museums into tekkes, they do attempt to use them for ritual purposes as much as possible. The attitude of the Alevis is not only explained by their continued separation from the space of their old tekkes. A similar approach is to be found in the Cemal Foundation, which was created by the descendants of Kenan Rifai. In this case, even though the family kept possession of the building after the tekke was closed, the choice to turn a part of the building into a museum was their own. Officially, the reconstructed Semahane of the headquarters of the Cemal Foundation functions as a private museum and a concert hall. Yet, the members of the foundation continue to discreetly observe ritual practices in relation to this space, such as not turning their back to the Semahane when they walk out of it, or saluting the tomb of Kenan Rifai's mother when walking in and out of the building, not to mention praying before and after concerts of Sufi music. The blurry boundary between a concert and a sema, a conference and a sohbet also reveal that the museumization of this space does not imply a full secularization of it. These practices, which I consider tactical expressions of resistance to the extinction of the place as a tekke, coincide with the sincere conviction that the place is not a tekke anymore. Unlike the Alevis, the director of the Cemal Foundation and grandson of Kenan Rifai, does not see the case of this building as an exception to the closure of the tekkes, but rather emphasizes the fact that Kenan Rifai closed it himself as soon as he heard of the new law. His lack of resistance to the measure is congruent with his conviction that tekkes are not a specific form of building, but a place where God is remembered and where Sufi wisdom is transmitted, so the universe itself or the heart of the believer can be understood as tekkes, and the transmission of Sufism is not limited to ritual. These cases are rare examples of situations in which a Sufi lineage preserved a connection to the museumized space of its pre-republican tekkes. Most of the museumized tekkes, however, have been disconnected from their previous lineages, which further complicates their public presentations as tekkes in the present. Bursa offers two examples of restored and museumized tekkes that have been put under the management of contemporary Sufi foundations that hold no direct relation to the original inhabitants of these places. The Üftade Tekke, founded by the Pir of the Celveti order, is managed by the Aziz Mahmud Hudai Foundation. Aziz Mahmud Hudai was the disciple of the 16th century mystic Üftade, and he founded a Celveti Tekke in Üsküdar upon instruction from his master. Hudai's tomb is one of the main sites of pilgrimage in Istanbul. However, the Hudai Foundation is not a Celveti community, but an organization created by members of the Erenköy Cemaat, a Naqshbandi group that was accused of instigating the Menemen revolt in 1930. Their sheikh at the time, Sheikh Asst, and his son were tried and sentenced to death in a legal process whose legitimacy has only been recently questioned by historians. Erasure of social memory of both a stigma and the fate of another Sufi community underlies this colonization of Jalbeti places and symbols. At the Ustade Tekke, no mention is made of what happened to the Jalbeti dervishes and that inhabited the place before 1925, as if they had vanished into thin air, which bears an uncanny resemblance to the erasure of the memory of the very existence of some indigenous peoples who were subjected to genocidal processes during the colonization of their lands. Another case where the memory of the original inhabitants of a museumized tekke has been utterly erased is the Karabashiveli tekke. This tekke is managed by the Sufism Foundation since the end of its restoration in 2005. Almost nothing is said at that place about the last generation of Qadiri dervishes that had used the tekke until 1925, and almost no attention is paid to their tombs. The Sufi credentials of the Sufism Foundation are, on top of that erasure of historical memory, ambiguous and doubtful. While the community does have a leader, Mustafa Uzba, who is mostly referred to with the word Ustad rather than more traditional Sufi titles such as Sheikh, Baba, Dede, or Murshid, this foundation does engage in tekke activities such as sohbet, zikr, and sema. But they do so in ways that are found unacceptable by other Sufi communities, especially the International Mevlana Foundation. Particularly the performance of Sema, which is done in a shortened version of circa 15 minutes every day rather than as a long weekly ritual, is explicitly presented as a show in which people who have not been initiated into a tariqa participate as if it were a folkloric dance. According to the Chelevis, no one who has not received permission from the Makam Chelevi should be guiding a Sema, a permission that, as they denounce, Uzba does not have. Moreover, rather than claiming to teach the spiritual path of a tariqa, this group claims a vague Sufi identity and affirms to have people from at least 10 tariqats among its members. But what is perhaps more troublesome is the conspicuous political use of Sufi motifs by this foundation, whose ideology is as based on right-wing ultranationalist discourse as on allegedly Sufi practices. Apart from their demonstrations of Turkish Sufi culture, this foundation frequently organizes rallies in support of the ruling party at key political moments, such as the Turkish military incursions in northern Syria. There is, however, an example of an even more radical erasure of memory of the Sufi significance of tekkes that have been museumized, as I could corroborate in Samsun. There are only two places in Samsun that are publicly named tekkes: the Sadi Tekke, which is nowadays a museum that focuses on its role during the War of Independence, and the Ajem Tekke, nowadays used as an Iranian restaurant and a conference hall, which was probably never a tekke in the sense of being a gathering place for the members of a tariqa. As far as the historical records show, this place was rather a house for Persian expats, mainly traders, and the only ritual that is known to have taken place there was the celebration of Ashura. Although nowadays Samsun is generally imagined as a rather secular city, better remembered for tobacco production and for maritime trade, like all Ottoman territories, it does have a Sufi past. Probably its oldest and more significant Sufi presence was that of three Qadiri brothers, who are believed to have settled in the region in the 11th century. In fact, a smaller town on the outskirts of Samsun is named Tekke Köy, Tekke village, because it was founded around the tekke of one of these brothers, Yusuf Zainuddin. But perhaps ironically, there is no tekke in Tekke Köy anymore, nor any attempt to rebuild this or any of the other two tekkes until today. However, one does find people praying at the turbes of these three brothers, particularly at the turbe of Sheikh Qutbuddin, which is located in Samsun's oldest cemetery, but also at the turbe of Sheikh Cemal, which is in a rural area in Çarşamba near the airport of Samsun. The presence of people at the turbes signifies social memory of these places as connected to the blessing of these bellies, something that is utterly lacking at both the Sadi tekke and the Ajem tekke. So the criteria used to restore these places was clearly not their spiritual importance for the population of Samsun. In the Sadi tekke, the social role of Sufis is mainly represented as that of war heroes of the War of Independence. At the Ajem tekke, which was probably never a tekke, there is no significant information about Sufism. Yet the conference hall of the second floor is decorated with carvings and figurines in the form of meubles semascens of the kind that are sold to tourists. There is a banality in the appropriation of Sufi symbols at these places that indicates indifference to Sufism per se in the process of appropriation of Sufi places as examples of national culture. Finally, let me talk to you about the museum tekke as an arché. This tekke remained active until 1925, when all tekkes were closed. It's a statement one can find written on almost every plaque or board outside the restored tekke in contemporary Turkey. The year of 1925 marks a border in time. It splits the time of the tekkes between a past of abundance and a present of scarcity or inexistence. Thus, the law of tekkes and zaviyes also inaugurates a binary. The identity of tekkes was transformed. They became old or new, not in virtue of their actual age, but of their position regarding that imposed border in time. According to the early Republican ideology, tekkes did not belong in the nation's present. They were considered archaic institutions, unfit for modern life, and fixed in their right time by actively ruinating them. As Derrida has observed, the root arché names at once the commencement and the commandment. The closure of the tekkes was the commandment that turned pre-Republican tekkes into originals, to which any new places of gathering for Sufi communities could be compared to determine their authenticity or to imitate them. The law of tekkes and zaviyes provided the Sufi lodges that existed at the time with a unifying characteristic that would become an implicit alliance between them, something that separated them from any tekkes established after 1925, pastness. Whether a tekke was only a decade or 300 years old at the time of their official closing, the law unified them and imbued those that were not completely destroyed with the age value of relics that George Cemal described in his essay, The Ruin. However, unlike Cemal's understanding of ruination as a cosmic tragedy, which is not sad, but the product of nature winning over culture, of people passively allowing things to decay, the ruination of tekkes was the product of a deliberate disruption that violently imposed an artificial sense of pastness. For Yael Navarro Yashin, this kind of ruination is not only visible in, I quote, the material remains of artifacts of destruction and violation, but also on the subjectivities and residual affects that linger like a hangover in the aftermath of war or violence, end of quote. Since their closure and until now, the constant presence of people praying at the turbes at some of the ruinated tekkes has been interpreted as such an affective expression that lingers, resisting the complete erasure of these places from collective memory. As a product of the double bind of Sufi communities with the state, the ruinated tekkes lost their right to exist in the present as living social institutions, but gained the age value of relics and the right to public appearance as objects of national heritage. Indeed, the identity of the tekke in contemporary Turkey has become so divorced from Sufi presences that the restored Ajem tekke is publicly presented with that term, even though it is not clear that it ever hosted Sufis. Because pre-Republican tekkes acquire authenticity from their pastness, restoration comes with the danger of being perceived as an undermining the tekke's pastness, since it erases the traces of the passage of time and blurs the visual difference between originals and copies. If we compare, for example, the restored Karabashi Veli tekke in Bursa with the new building, which was yet to be completed and inaugurated at the time of my fieldwork, that was being built for the Sufism Foundation, both look like new copies of Ottoman tekkes. And in fact, the paint on the exterior walls of the restored tekke makes it look newer than the completely new building, at least to the untrained eye. However, the presence of a picture of the building before the restoration and a plaque with explanations on its history preserve the age value of the place despite the transformation caused by the restoration process. The effect of patina is thus substituted by the authority of the archive and the expert, and the impression of pastness is produced despite the new appearance of the relic. The proof provided by a picture and a plaque are enough to convince most visitors that a building was indeed a tekke before 1925, regardless of how new it looks after its restoration, and that this identity remains despite their new function. The exhibition of original objects as museum pieces also contributes to the value as relics of these tekkes. Both the history of this connection with dervish activities and the appropriation of Sufi symbols as national culture establish the background against which this use of a tekke can enjoy credibility. So I want to conclude with a remark. In a recent interview to Bahatan Mam, who is probably Turkey's biggest authority on tekke architecture, he was asked what element is indispensable to identify a tekke. Perhaps surprisingly, he did not choose to mention the semahane, the main space for ritual, but the kitchen. The reason behind his answer is that he understands the concept of the tekke from a Sufi perspective that sees beyond the culturalization that has enabled the public presentation of tekkes as museums. For him, as for most of my Sufi interlocutors, a tekke without spirituality is not a tekke. Yet, why is the kitchen an indicator of spirituality? As Tanmam explained, tekkes also had an imaret function. They provided food and shelter to those who requested it. In my own work, I argue that this function should not be confused with the concept of charity, but rather understood as hospitality. Unlike charity, which is based on a differentiation between those who have and those who lack, hospitality is a principle of being for the other that acknowledges universal vulnerability and, as Levinas understands it, an ethical form of transcendence. Hospitality has a crucial role in the spiritual education of Sufis, who put themselves at the service of others to discipline and annihilate their nefs. Museums lack the capacity to be hospitable in the same sense tekkes are. Their representation of Sufism is centered on the particularities of ritual or on the artistic value of objects and of the buildings themselves, but not on practices of transcendence. At best, some Sufi organizations like the Hudai Foundation sustain soup kitchens, but these have the characteristics of a charity, since they are specifically addressed to the needy. That is not the case of tekkes that have been founded in places like apartment buildings, which, although lacking the material heritage of a museum, are sustained by a commitment to a mystical tradition for whom hospitality is not just one amongst many functions, but a crucial form of spiritual training. This is also the reason why the few pre-Republican tekkes that remain under the control of their tarikats have resisted the museumization of their buildings. The main form of restoration of tekke buildings throughout Turkey nowadays is far from being a labor of recuperation of Sufi culture. It is rather a seal that completes its secularization. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Lucy'ye çok teşekkür ederiz bu değerli katkı için. Şimdi 15 dakikalık bir süremiz var. Ben yorumlarımı kısaca vermeden önce.
Thank you very much for your contributions. Now we have 15 minutes for the Q&A, and I would like to kindly ask the listeners to write their questions in the Q&A box. But let me briefly summarize. Cemal made reference to important scholars such as Lefebvre, Nora, and others, and he explained how the transformations took place in the Alevite spaces. And he also talked about how, through what external and internal factors the Alevite social space has changed, and he excellently explained us that transformation process. And within the framework of the notes that I have taken down, I can perhaps say that these type of places continue to change, such as urbanization, different demands from CEMEVIS, or, for example, the deserted visiting places in the rural parts. So due to all of these different factors, in fact, there is a loss of memory. And the external factors were also listed by Cemal. He talked about the special policies of the Sunnite Islamic State for the unorthodox faiths and the different types of sanctions used by the state, and among which most important of all is not granting the place of worship status to the CEMEVIS. Cemal pointed to a very important issue as well. He said that the Alevi places of worship intersect or coincide with the Alevi social spaces, and there is a continuous movement in these places, and depending on the need, certain places would be transformed into places of worship. But again, due to external factors such as migration, urbanization, and others, especially in the recent times, some places of worship began to change the qualities, and they began to stand out as stand-only places of worship. And they stop their multiple functions, and that also leads to certain changes in the Alevite faith. Of course, we're not considering this as neither positive nor negative, but at least we can, when we think about the European context, when we think about the Alevi diaspora in Europe, this could be considered as the transformation of CEMEVIS into church-like places. And for the Turkish case, we would use the term as mosque-like places, of course. Now, with your permission, I would like to ask a question without taking much of your time. Now, we talked about urbanization, modernization, and with these processes, obviously, the places of worship and the social spaces change, and we can easily make a reading of this change in the particular case of Alevis, and especially in the recent years. We know that jams are organized online, on TV, on radios. We know that in the jams, what really matters is to come face to face and to see each other's eyes without any intermediary. And that is the main element in the jam circles. However, with the modernization and with the globalization and with their implications, this begins to change. This is what we see. So how can we have a sema ritual or jam through the radio? And when we do that, how does it translate into the convergence of the CEMEVIS or the social space of the Alevis? I'd like to learn your take on this question. And to Ms. Salazar, I have some questions. And Ms. Salazar gave us a glimpse of her own PhD dissertation. Bursa, Konya, Samsun provinces were some of the provinces that she visited as part of her research study. And she explained us about the convergence of space. And she made reference to Levinas and Cemal, and these two scholars are also very dear to me in my own work. She also talked about the Mevlevihane in Konya and the Tekke in Samsun, and she explained us the changes since 1920s in these places specifically. And in the last part of her presentation, she emphasized an important thing, I guess. This is crucial. That is, the tekkes, the spiritual places of tekkes have now changed, and now we see museumification of these places, and these are no longer the places, in fact, where only Semazens dance. In fact, these were the places where they had mutfaks in the past. And what she emphasized there was very important, because the mutfaks, or the food that are cooked in those kitchens, in those soup kitchens, did not only have the intention of a charity donation. Rather, these places meant that those providing that service are trying to control their own ego or nefs. And that was also an instrument for self-discipline for these people who were serving the food. And she drew our attention to that, and we can really understand why Lucia is making reference to Levinas. This is something that I can really understand that reference now. And also to Ms. Salazar, I would like to ask a question as well, which is this. Now, we know that in 1925, for instance, many Bektaşis migrated to distant geographies, such as the United States. They had to do that. They went to, most of them went to Detroit, and there they have their own Jemaat, they have their own peers, and we know that Sufism had to go beyond these borders because of the developments taking place in Turkey or in Europe. And of course, she was not talking about this, but I would like to learn more about these processes. I wonder if similar things happened for Mexico, starting with 1920s. For example, yeah, I mean, there was communism, there was the introduction of communism in Albania, and before that, Bektaşis would almost become the official religion for Albania, but then they had to migrate to the US. So could you give us similar examples from Mexico with regard to Sufism? And also, I'm just checking the Q&A box. Everybody is, all are sending messages for congratulating the speakers. Thank you so much for the interest. Now we have 6 minutes left, so I would like to first of all hear Cemal and then Lucia. And of course, if we get an extra question, I will also pose those questions. Thank you. Thank you so much. I would like to apologize for taking too much of time, so I will be briefer this time in order not to steal away Ms. Salazar's time. And yes, there are radio broadcasts of JAM. On one hand, we can say that this is in fact catering for a need, because for many years there were many accusations, and JAM is now being opened up so that other people can also understand that this is not what they always accused of. But of course, no matter what kind of a reason is lying behind these radio broadcasts of JAM, like you have said, the essence of these rituals is, I mean, not to have any formal restrictions. And also, after you purify yourself, you attend the JAM. For that reason, I mean, visualization of jams is creating a problem, and Alevis among themselves consider these as jam performances, and this is not something that needs to be appreciated. I'm not saying that I'm a traditionalist. However, in the Alevite tradition, the essence matters. So you have to live that in yourself, in your life. So you cannot only perform it. That needs to be clearly understood, perform it in the sense of a performance. This is all I would like to say. Thank you. Thank you, Cemal. Lucia, would you like to take the floor, please?
Yes, thank you very much. I will answer in English also, if you don't mind. Thank you for your interesting question. I know about this migration of Bektashis to the West. I find it really fascinating too, but to my knowledge, there are no Bektashi presences in Mexico. The arrival of Sufism to Latin America came about much later in history. So the first large Sufi group that I found in Mexico, and actually this is how I started studying Sufism, because I first came across this Sufi community in Mexico City, and because it was connected to Turkey, that led me to study about Sufism in Turkey. So the first Sufi community that was founded in Mexico was a Halbeti Jarrahi community. That was the product of the visits of Musafir Effendi, who was in the 80s the sheikh of the Jarrahi dervishes. He traveled to Europe and to America in the 80s, and he got some new disciples in America. So the first one was the one who invited him. He was from Turkey, but he also got some new American dervishes. So particularly two sheikh who became Sheikh Nur and Sheikh Fariha, who established Tekke in New York City. So Sheikh Nur traveled in the 80s to Mexico City, and he established a tekke there. So this is to this day the largest Sufi community in Mexico. Now they have separated somehow from the community in Turkey. Their reasons for this are complex. I have recently published an article about it in case anyone is interested. But now the community in Mexico and in New York have taken the name of the Nur Ashki Jarrahi group, because they take the name from Sheikh Musafir Effendi, who was also named Ashki. And there are other Sufi presences in Mexico, particularly the most well-known one is one in the state of Chiapas, and who is made of primarily of indigenous converts. And for this reason, it has called a lot of mediatic attention. But you won't find many references about them in the media as Sufis. You will only find them referred as Muslims. Basically as Mayan Muslims, because this is what calls the attention of the media, right? But actually this group was created by a sheikh of Scottish origin who claims to belong to a Moroccan tariqa. So officially this would also be a Sufi group, which has also split into groups. And there are other kinds of more discrete, let's say, Sufi presences in Mexico nowadays. We have a sheikh who comes from the Qadri Rifai group, that who's like Astane in Istanbul is the Aini Ali Tekke. So there was a sheikh from there who traveled to America also around the 70s, I think. And he started a group in America. So the sheikh in Mexico, he is connected to that sheikh who is still living in America, but they are also now disconnected from the group in Turkey. You can say that there is this time of approach from Turkey to the West, and then there is this slow disconnection where they go separate ways, these Sufi communities. Particularly in Turkey, Sufis maintained a more, I don't like the word orthodox, but a more strict Sunni practice of Islam. Whereas in America that became very difficult, especially with converts who didn't have any Muslim background and who had to acquire all this education from zero. So there's more success of a universalist interpretation of Sufism that grew among these communities and created differences between the groups in Mexico and Latin America and in Turkey. And there's also the case of an Naqshbandi group that is mostly strong in Argentina, but they travel to Mexico every now and then. So those are the Sufi presences that I can tell you I have found in Mexico. Unfortunately, no Bektashis to this day.
Teşekkürler. Lucia, çok teşekkürler.
Thank you very much, Lucia. And what you have told us reminds us something else. Now, the media representations of these types of communities or groups and how they are defined by the majority. So usually they are stigmatized as Muslims, and the nuances are lost, and that richness, that diversity is also lost. And of course, scientific research, scientific study will definitely contribute to bring about the truth about these groups. And thank you very much. We have come to the end of this session. I really enjoyed this, and I see the messages of our speakers, and I think they've also enjoyed. Once more, I would like to remind you that you can enroll in adipanadolu.org website, and you can continue the discussions on the forum there. And once again, I would like to thank the organizers, and now I would like to give the floor to our presenter.